Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And today we are talking to our friend Kehlan Morgan, who runs the Formscapes YouTube channel, about the philosophical nature of should. And we are trying to derive from this scientific worldview if there is something about the inherent quality of humans and nature from which we can derive the direction in which we should evolve. And that's a pretty lofty goal. And in order to actually piece all of this together, we kind of have to start from the very basics, which is, okay, well, what are we actually experiencing? What does the world actually look like? And so we go through some fundamental physics stuff about, is this Newtonian study of systems in isolation where they can be reduced to the simplest components and parameterized the most effective way of encountering nature, or should we consider it in this more symphonic sense, where beings tune to various aspects of an enormous symphony? And once we establish all of these parameters for how beings interact with the world through their sensoriums, then we can start to ask the question of, okay, well, what the hell is this project about? Like, why are there humans? What is the purpose of humans? What is the purpose of nature? What is the purpose of existence? And in line with other conversations that we've had, we do this through the lens of Rudolf Steiner and Goethe, which I always feel like I mispronounce.
Goethe.
Goethe. Yeah, there's an R in there. Not really though. But basically, Kehlan guides us through this philosophical exploration of these deeply aligned thinkers that are trying to say that there's some
Intentionality that can't be ignored in these evolutionary processes that play out, and that we don't necessarily get ourselves closer to understanding by acting like evolution is this stupid passive force in the background.
Yeah, exactly. So this leads us very neatly to, in the last part of the conversation, an exploration of transhumanism. I think a lot of people are a little bit leery about the idea of merging with machines and putting consciousness into machines and reproducing people that you might love and have lost inside of machines. And where does that feeling of unease come from? Why does that feel so spooky and weird? Should it feel so spooky and weird? Is there some ingredient that we can pick out of it that says that this isn't what we should do because of some larger biological principles? In order to find out, you're gonna have to listen to the entire conversation because we get to it only at the very end. But as always, talking to Kehlan is amazing because he's read so deeply and widely that he can map the way that all of these things fit together, and it's a real pleasure to be able to just sit around and explore his brain for a couple hours. So thank you to Kehlan, Formscapes. Everybody should check out his YouTube channel if you haven't already. Check out the other conversation that we had with him, I just liked to hear. And
I'm really impressed that you were able to summarize this conversation because it was wide-ranging all over the place, but that is exactly what we ended up at and where we came from. Podcast is entirely paid for by listeners. We are very proud of this. We have an incredible crew over at patreon.com/demystifysci. We get together with patrons once a week, hang out, chop it up about all our favorite topics, and we are extremely pleased to have a program here that is not plastered in ads. We are not wearing NASCAR jackets. We are not selling tchotchkes. We're not selling anything that has anything to do with anything other than what we explore on this show. But that means that we absolutely depend on you and we work directly for you. So consider chipping in over at patreon.com/demystifysci.
And if you really like what we do, you should consider coming to our conference in Portugal of June of next year. Tickets will go on sale soon to Patreons first. Patrons will be able to have early access to our very, very limited ticket sales. 50 people are going to be at the conference, plus some incredible guest speakers. Confirmed we have right now Gareth Samuel of See the Pattern, Alexander Unziker of Unziker's Real Physics, and Andre Koch Torres Assis, who's been on this program twice talking about Weberian electrodynamics and is going to present on problems with the Big Bang and current cosmological paradigms, because this conference is all about the crisis in cosmology and how it can be fixed.
There's going to be more speakers too. We're just going to wait until we get these tickets out to announce those. So yeah, you can support the pod in a lot of different ways. You could also just tell people about it, share it. It's completely free for you and does a lot for us in terms of being able to reach more people and get bigger and better guests. So get involved in any way you can and enjoy this conversation with Kehlan. Yeah, we'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Let us see in the dark.
Probably the vibe that I imagine most people get from anthroposophy is like this very like almost monkish type of thing. But I mean, a lot of the people are just really cool people, which is nice. But anyway, yeah, the Goethe thing and all that, like there's a lot of, I mean, that's just a whole universe, but it's so underground that, I mean, you can just, I mean, unless you're looking for it, you'll never even find it, you know?
And that was what was so weird. So we actually just after the conference, I've been working on getting recordings with all of the people who were either presenting or were somehow instrumental to organizing the conference. And we just released today an episode of one of the organizers who like charts out this entire, I mean, history that you know already, but it's basically the history of Goethean science and anthroposophy and everything else. And I've just been seeing it a lot more in places. And so I feel like there's this tension between the
I got another professor at my school hooked on it actually this last week. It was kind of funny. Like I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, you should tell the story about the magenta thing. I think that's
It
a
was just
perfect
really funny. Yeah,
explanation.
there's just some professor who teaches an auditorium after me. Well, actually, she was doing some sort of movie night or something. But anyway, she's the chair of the chemistry department, and I guess I just outed her. That's not very nice. Anyways, who cares?
Well, I think that nobody knows about this stuff, and I think that she reacted to it in the best way possible. She basically shows up and she's having a night where she's like, "Did you know that there's no such thing as magenta?" And I'd seen this stuff before on the internet, right? Where there's just all of these videos.
It's like a common thing that magenta is not in the Newtonian spectrum, and that the only way to create magenta is the overlap of two gas lines, and blah blah blah.
Yeah, it suggests that it's some kind of illusion, and that like our brains make it up. And I remember being like, I don't think that's true. And then we came across this Per Sol video about the purple ray in the Goethean color spectrum. And I just remember watching it with my jaw on the floor, being like, how did I not know this? And what did you...
I don't know. I told her about the Goethean spectrum, and she kind of went away. And she came back and she's like, all right, I think I figured this out. And she diagrammed out this explanation that was, if you'd only watched the first half of that, who was it? Parasol?
Parasol, yeah.
If you only watch the first half, there is an explanation for how you get the purple to split apart in the shadow, but the reflected shadow in the light is where you actually get the continuation of this purple ray. So I sent her that video, and then she came back the next week and was just like, I have no fucking clue what's going on. This is crazy. And I don't know. It was just really fun. It was fun.
I actually found another thing related to that recently, because I was doing a lot of just digging into stuff about color and light and all that, and I found this article. I'll send it to you guys because you'll find it really interesting. There's this very long piece talking about primary colors and how it relates to the geometry of spheres and all this neat stuff. And he gets really hung up on this one thing that Goethe says. So the person writing this is obviously not some kind of woo-woo anthroposophist, because he's really, talking about everything in very Newtonian terms for the most part. But he gets really hung up on this thing where Goethe came to the conclusion that violet was a primary color because he could produce it through just the basic interactions of light and darkness without having to combine any colors together. And, the person writing the article is getting really hung up on this because they're like, well, that doesn't really make any sense, though. You can't combine any two colors to create blue or to create yellow, right? But you can create violet through just red and blue. So how is it that violet is popping up at this border between the darkest shade of blue and pure black if there's no red there? in order to produce it. And so he ends up jumping through all of these crazy hoops to try and explain how that's happening. And I mean, I guess the explanation kind of sort of works or whatever. I'll show it to you guys. But the entire time I'm reading this, I'm thinking like, it feels to me like this is unnecessary. It feels to me like there's this affinity between red and black that is somehow facilitating that we're not taking into consideration because we're thinking of black as just the pure absence of color. But I think there's something going on there, something to do maybe like with infrared, even that could actually affect the way that we see colors, even though we're not seeing that like the red directly. I don't know. I'm kind of speculating at this point, but anyway, that's something you guys will find really interesting, I think, for sure.
But I think that this is tied to what I was saying before we got waylaid, or not waylaid, but sort of like redirected.
I just want to say I am working on a theory of this in the back of my head at all hours of the day.
Yeah.
And I'm very close to something. I'm not quite ready to drop it right now, but I think it has to do with the phase relationships of the individual atoms. But we can we'll play with that later.
Okay.
We'll come back. We'll come back.
But I think that what it suggests, and this is kind of a bold statement, is that our understanding of the nature of colors and like and the relationship of wavelength to the color and the relationship of the prism to the production of the color is probably going to have to be modified somewhat. Because if you have a prism that produces a rainbow, and the amount of deflection of that white light is what gives you the wavelength of the light, right? That's where the wavelength of the light is derived from. The interaction
like
of
the speed at which it travels in the medium and that's essentially going to separate out the wavelengths from one another.
Yeah, exactly. And so if all of a sudden you can invert the experiment and get different colors of light, that means that you're getting different wavelengths of light. But that doesn't make any sense with this using the same theory that the deflection is what's giving you the wavelength, because there's no change in the light that you're putting through it. You're just looking at the inverse of it. Ergo, there must be something like Shiloh's saying about phase relationships as
There's
opposed
like interference
to
of some sort going on that's really interesting.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It's geometrically determined. And so then you get like, ultimately you have to start asking yourself, what the hell is interference? And like, why are there bands of shadow being projected in the most simple diffraction experiments? And so you have to think of like, how are those atoms being silenced from lighting up essentially? And so you get into the phase relationship of light, I think, at some point, and how that affects color. Have you seen the 3 blue, 1 brown video about refraction and the phase phase effects of refraction that cause the illusion of light slowing down inside of
I
me?
haven't watched that channel in a long time,
Okay.
so I'm probably not going to remember the details. No, if I have seen it.
I think there's a lot of it's a really interesting point. It's worth watching, everybody.
I think that we should. I need to spend more time discreetly thinking about this, because, like with Shiloh, I think that the question of what the hell this means is constantly on my mind, and I don't know what it means, but I think that it suggests that a paradigm is shifting. Go ahead.
Let me interject something here, because I think there's at least one piece of the puzzle that I think I figured out, and it's this. It's that our actual perception of color is not the perception of a physical property at all. It is quite literally the same thing as our perception of musical forms. Okay, so this is something that Steiner talks about extensively in relation to both music and color. He says when you're listening to music, you're not hearing frequencies. You're not hearing, like, I mean, that's there. That's like the medium of what is happening that makes it available to your sensory organs. But what you're actually perceiving as music is not that. What you're hearing are what you could call the harmonic structures. You're hearing the chords, you're hearing the rhythm, you're hearing these overarching patterns that just do not operate in the way that physical properties do. So, for example, that perception can be completely retrocausal, for example. So if you play like a diminished chord just by itself, super dissonant, you got the tritones in there, it sounds very ugly if you just sit there and like strum on a diminished chord by itself, right? But then you can play a diminished chord as the opening chord of your song and then immediately resolve it into like a major sharp 11 or something like that. And then it's like, oh, it makes sense now. So so your mind, it's like it almost steps outside of time in a way, in the way that it's perceiving this holistic organic unity of what's happening. And I think what's going on with color is the exact same thing. Our perception of color is, I would go so far as to say, it's not a sensation at all. It is actually it's seeing through that which is available to the senses with the mind, really. And I think if we start looking at it that way as a relational property rather than as a static property of like the frequency of a wave, for example, or the whatever photons are supposedly doing, then we can start to make sense of these things, because then we can look at like the ray of magenta, right? There's no magentaness that's just there in that ray by itself. It's something to do with the way that that ray of shadow knows that it is contextualized by these other things, by the ray of light that then is being intersected by the rod or whatever you're using to produce the shadow. Like somehow that's all there within that ray of magenta in a way that's really weird, because it's almost like the way that we perceive music, where we see this kind of holistic unity. It's like the light's already doing that without us even necessarily like piecing it together in a way. It's very strange, but that's what I've been thinking anyway.
As you were talking, I was thinking about all these visual illusions that I come across, where I showed a couple of them last time we talked, actually. And then there was another one that I came across the other day, which was a black and white photograph where somebody had drawn stripes of varying colors across the people's clothes, and it looked like it was a color photograph. Like, if you zoomed in and you looked in between the stripes, you could see that it was still black and white, but by virtue of the fact that there were colorful stripes, you know, somebody's t-shirt was striped green, somebody's was striped red, from a sufficient distance, you're like, oh, the brain just fills in those spaces. And so as you're saying this, I'm like, it does sound accurate. The brain is doing something that isn't just seeing little photon bullets of color wavelengths. It's this softer filling in of things.
But that's where we have to be careful, though, because it's so easy for us to slip back into that Cartesian way of looking at it. Oh, the brain's doing it. Because the thing is, once you do that, that's how you end up with this kind of Newtonian paradox, right? Like Newton is looking at the color and he's like, okay, so we have this visible sensory phenomena. And so how do we make sense of that? And he saw that there were these contextual aspects of it. And so what he ultimately ends up doing is saying, oh, okay, well, there are these little BBs down there somewhere that the light is made out of. And his color theory effectively stops being a theory of color at all, because he ends up saying, well, okay, that's really just secondary properties. He defers to John Locke effectively in saying that they're the primary qualities, which are just the corpuscles, the wavelengths, or the BBs, whatever. And then the color itself is just in our heads. And that's the thing that I think we really have to somehow sidestep here, because insofar as we do that, we're doing this thing where we're cutting ourselves off from the universe, where we end up in this Kantian Cartesian prison where it's like there's this bubble, which is our phenomenological experience of the world, and then there's the world in itself, which just does not have color, it does not have music, it does not have feelings. It's just this dead, inert stuff. And somehow that gap has to be bridged, right? Because otherwise you just end up into this impossible problem of the hard problem of consciousness, as they say, where you're trying to figure out how experience can be part of a world that isn't supposed to have anything like that in it, and yet here we are experiencing the world, feeling emotions, seeing colors, things like that. And I think the solution here is, and this is where things are going to get really spooky, and I really have not figured this out yet, like how do you really make this work, but somehow those relational properties are not just properties of perception. I think, you know, like especially like what you were just saying, you've got these stripes and it's just like black and white, but then it appears as though they're colors. If we really take the conclusions of Goethe's research seriously, I think we can go further than that. I think we can say, no, the colors are there because they are the relational properties between the light and the darkness. It's not just in our brains. It actually is, like, those relationships are actually there in the world as well.
I think so. And the reason I think that it gets confused is because physicists want to talk about how atoms make colors, but the reality of the situation is that only isolated atoms, like in gases, will make a color. And they don't make all colors too, right? You cannot make, like we keep saying, magenta with a single atom. And so things get kind of crazy when you start talking about heated bodies because they make all colors, and they do make all colors depending on how you split them up, but they're not individually making all colors. It's not like they have an atom making each color. It's the relationships between all of the atoms and the interference in the phase relationship of their polarization that ultimately results in the production of this interference of all these different vibrations at different lengths with different resonant chains amongst all of the atoms so that you actually get the production of this really wide frequency band. And then if you want to pull different colors out of it, then you have to go to do something like the prism, which is a new relational experience that's happening where new atoms are relating with their neighbors and this whole other symphony is being produced essentially. And I think the physicists want to say, no, it's just something like what happens when you take a single individual atom and it vibrates and gives a color. And so there must be some way to reduce this to individual atoms producing this somehow, but it's just not so simple.
Well, I think that at some level there is like a necessity of winnowing it down to something that can be studied, where I think that there's a tendency, like if I understand the difference between the Goethean science and the Newtonian science, it's that Newton has this Experimentum Crucis, where he demonstrates that you put light through a prism, you get a rainbow. This is where you have the decomposition of white light into all of the component colors, and this is representative of some true relationship, true with a capital T. And Goethe is like, oh, hold on a second. There's a myriad different conditions that you can create where you get a bunch of different results, and we need to be able to consider the sheer variety of effects and perspectives.
Like what you've learned as much about the prism as you have, maybe more about the prism than you have about the light source itself in such an experiment, right?
Yeah.
It's not just made out of the pieces that your instrument showed you, right? The same thing could be said of particle colliders or anything else. It's like, oh, we got all these like new particles, so this stuff must be made out of these particles. And it's like, well, your thing is designed to give you particles in the first place, so of course it's going to be made out of particles, whatever the hell that even means, which we could tear apart if we really wanted to. But yeah,
measurement events. That's the best explanation I think there is really for what a particle is. But well, let me bring this up real quick since we're just kind of like riffing on this. The idea of interference is really interesting here too. Like this is like, because I mean we see it in the double slit experiment, right? But like where else do you actually see interference in nature other than water waves? I mean, when is the last time you saw light interfere with itself? Like it doesn't seem.
I guess sound will do it.
Sound. Even then, it feels weird though, right? Like if you've got a symphony like playing, like you would expect there to be a lot of like dead spots. I mean, you can do it in like digitally. Like I mean, I make music, so I know this happens where you can have things where like the waves will like
Phase flip it or
cancel each
whatever.
other out,
Yeah.
and you'll get this weird dip. But it like maybe it's something to do with the geometry of the fact that you're working with like a three-dimensional wave that's happening, and that's why the interference doesn't seem to happen in the same way. But I don't know. I feel like there's some weird stuff there too that I'm not really savvy to either, honestly.
I mean, with light, I think. I mean, I think that a lot of the misunderstanding comes down to the fact that people don't really think about what's happening to atoms during light, which is really obvious in radio antennas, right? You change the polarity of the current through the atoms, and you get a commensurate wavelength of light from it. So the atoms are inverting in their polarity, whatever the hell that means. Like, we could play with that separately. But there's this phase of polarity, like either they're positively oriented or negatively oriented, like their shell, their electrons are doing this thing, whatever the hell that is.
If you hand me the computer, I can pull up the visual of that.
And so you have the opportunity for light to essentially convey. Light is some sort of transaction that conveys that that charge oscillation, right? And so, yeah, you have the opportunity for an atom to get a signal that says polarize up or polarize positively, and it also could get a signal depending on the geometry of the distance and the phase of the wave that tells it to go down. And if it gets a positive and a negative signal at the same time, well, it might not do anything. But if it gets a slightly it's slightly polarized positively and slightly polarized negatively, maybe you get some combination, and then it's interacting with its neighbor, and like before you know it, you get the appearance of wave forms that are complex but still approximate, certainly in our experience, colors at that point, right? And so this is just a complex, like unending complexity involved, especially the more that you multiply the number of atoms that you're looking at. Like in all of these experiments that we've been talking about, gazillions upon gazillions of atoms involved in this. And so I think that it's very difficult, and I understand the wish to reduce it down to a single atom doing this one thing, but I think aside from like a gas that's floating by itself making a single frequency, you're not going to be able to pull that off ever. And yeah, like I thought of peacock feathers when you were talking, by the way, because I was like, those are really, really colorful. But the funny thing is they don't have pigment, right? It's entirely based on diffraction. So if you zoom in with a microscope, you'll basically find that those are not pigmented cells. They're just these really carefully aligned rows of, I want to say protein, but it's probably not protein, some sort of biomaterial that forms these columns that basically result in the light getting interfered with and diffracting in such a way that it screens out the colors it doesn't want you to see and reflects back these just incredibly unreal, literally unreal colors that are not pigmented. Like they're not primary. They're not coming from an atom. They're coming from some concert of atoms interfering with each other. That's freaking crazy.
Do you want to do this antenna thing? Hold on. I'm so bad at this.
It's okay.
Hold on, I wanna.
Yeah.
There we go.
Oh yeah. I think this is like the easiest way to get a grip on what's happening during light. I think this is a receiver, but it may as well be a transmitter. You just power the oscillations. But yeah, I mean, you're just changing the direction that these atoms are electronically oriented, right? Whatever the heck that means. And we don't have to even really play with that to still understand that this is what's being transmitted during light. And you can get out of phase, and the phase relationships get super complex, right? And you can imagine these pseudo waves appearing where it's like, yeah, you have color experience. It doesn't even have to be an experience, but you have the production of real color, but it's not a primary atomic phenomena at that point, which is kind of nuts. So in some sense, I feel like that just reinforces what you're saying about the symphony being primary and the individual actor, like the individual air molecules bumping around is or the individual frequencies, if you want. Yeah, you can do a mathematical process, a Fourier transform, and take it apart into frequencies, but that's not what it's made out of.
Yeah. It's better to see the physical medium, well, as a medium, as like a vehicle, more so than the thing that everything reduces reduces to.
It's crazy. You can take it apart into individual frequencies, but it's not made out of individual frequencies. It's like, that's the thing with the particle colliders or even like the Ptolemaic universe. It's like, yeah, you can take the whole solar system apart into circles if you want. You could do it, but is it made out of circles?
Okay, well, so there's a couple of different threads here, which is the way that this experience of a thing that is out there is transformed into an internal experience. And so we have two kind of different realms. One realm is the realm of there are objects that are doing things that produce the natural world. And then there is the being that is in the natural world that has produced organs of some kind to be able to encounter it and then to make something meaningful out of it. And then on top of that is the next level of kind of abstraction, which is that the being then decides what is meaningful and worth acting upon. And so I think that there's this linear, or maybe not linear, maybe branched relationship between the world as it is and the being as it will become. And that's, like, I haven't sketched that out totally fully for myself yet, but I think that when we talk about something like the hard problem of consciousness, what we're really talking about is we're talking about, like, okay, well, how did we come to have the sensorium that we do, and the meaning attached to the sensorium that we do? And I don't know, I wonder, can it be directly linked to the atomic world, or does it always have to be, like, two different things?
I think it's a brilliant. I just had I mean, this has been a revelation for me.
Ahead.
Like the way that you put it, Kehlan, that's really changed the way that I'm seeing it. Because Keelan's like, look, it's not about our perception of the situation. Like and it's not about atoms necessarily either. Like you want to reduce it to single atoms or something. That's not going to give you the answer either. It's the whole concert of interactions in the physical world that matters here, and that saves you in some sense from having to ask this question. But it's cool. I mean, sorry. Go ahead, please, Kehlan.
Well, so you can think of it this way, for example, like an individual note. Like we have our designations for notes. You have the like standard like 430 or whatever it is, 440 tuning, where you can say, oh, okay, this middle C is that particular frequency. But assuming you don't have perfect pitch, which is another thing, if you just hear a note by itself, that's nothing. That has no tonal character. There's no color, right? Because it's just a note. But then you can contextualize it. You can put it inside of a major chord, and then you're like, oh, okay, that feels like something. And we can talk about it in terms of like, there's a sense of warmth there in contrast to like a minor chord, which is a little bit more contractive, more cool, you could say. But then that individual frequency of the note that you just contextualized into that major chord, I mean, you could take that and you could shift it into a different key and retain that same color, really. I mean, maybe you could say that by shifting it down in frequency, you're making it darker, perhaps. But overall, the thing that you're actually perceiving really is that harmonic relationship. That's what's giving it that phenomenological texture, as it were. And with sound, I think we can say that, at the very least, you've got these waves of air molecules that are facilitating that. That's how our ears detect sound. With light, I feel like there's something weirder going on, and it's hard to say exactly what. But like, if you look back to ancient philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, for example, there's always been this connection that people have seen between the like most basic nature of consciousness itself and light. That connection has always been made over and over and over again. And it's weird, like when you start really digging into it, this idea that the world of light is one of form. It is a world of creating delineations, kind of carving out form from formlessness, and the form that light facilitates is the creation of images. And so then you've got this contrast there between light and darkness, form and formlessness. And we could get very, very metaphysical with this, of course, but then at some point you've got to be able to connect that with your notion of physicality. Like, if light is this kind of pre-biological form of experience or something like that, of imagistic awareness, or we could throw all kinds of terms on it. How are like material things spitting that out? How is that happening when you like rub two sticks together and create a campfire, right? Like, how do these two worlds meet? And at some point, I mean, like, if we're taking seriously, and I think we have to, the assumption that it's really just one world, at some point, like, I think it's got to reveal itself in such a way that it's not a world over here and a world over here coming together. It's got to turn out to be somehow really just the same thing beneath these distinctions. And that's where things get really mysterious, because and honestly, the more I've thought about this, if you look at things from more of a kind of standard orthodox science perspective, it's like, okay, matter, we know what that is. But then consciousness, that's spooky and weird, and yeah, leave that to the philosophers. The more I do this, the more I'm thinking like, no, it's actually the other way around. It's actually matter. Physicality is the thing that like barely makes sense, like, if we're just starting from our most basic experiences and kind of working our way outward in this phenomenological way, and doing kind of empirical science in that matter, through this kind of Goethean method, then you can make sense of things like color and music and whatnot. But then, like, a rock, like, how do you make sense of that, really? Like, how do you really make sense of how you can have this world of extended surfaces that comes out of these relationships of feeling and experience and images and whatnot? Like, so anyway, point being, it's like, if you look at it from that perspective, it's like consciousness starts to be the obvious thing and matter starts to be the really spooky, mysterious thing. So
My first thought while listening to this is I'm like, well, bat metaphysics would be really different, right? So humans they have great visual acuity, and so light and consciousness are inexorably linked. But the bat metaphysics would be that like sound and consciousness are inexorably linked. Dog metaphysics might be that smell and consciousness are inexorably linked. And so I think that there is
Most animals' vision sucks.
Yeah, like I'm thinking about like moles and stuff. I guess
most animals don't have color perception as acute as us.
Sure.
Even most primates.
But I think that this leads to kind of understanding this better, which is that there is a world out there. There's a symphony, and you choose as an organism the things that you will get really good at hearing. And so we have chosen to be sight-oriented creatures, and so it makes sense that since the ancient Greek world, when people were trying to figure out like, what is all of this? Where does all of this come from? That sight and light would be so deeply linked to each other, because that is.
Did you hear her sneak in her theory that evolution is a choice?
We'll get there, but I'm like, there's just such an obvious human centrism to it, where it's like, it's easiest to understand what's going on if you can see it. Right? Like if you think about the way that all of the senses work, and if you were to pare down to only one single sense, if you couldn't smell, touch, taste, or hear, but you could see, you would still get like a pretty decent understanding of what's happening in most cases. In the sense of like the immediate understanding of like what is happening. But if the only thing that you could do was smell, you're kind of screwed.
Unless you're a bug underground.
But I'm saying, like, as a human, like, in the human world, if we put ourselves into this exact moment, and obviously in this exact moment, a little bit artificial because we have Zoom, and so we obviously have to be able to hear. But in general, as you go out into the world, I can imagine a condition where I can't hear, smell, touch, or taste, but I can see and I can navigate it pretty well. But if you take away sight, that immediately falls apart. And so to me, it makes it apparent that that's why we link light and consciousness, because you put us in the dark and we're suddenly aimless and hapless. But that's a human, that's like a human speciality. Not everybody's like that.
Kehlan also has a really good point about the strange exceptionalism of consciousness in the hard sciences, which is, we had a really interesting conversation with this dude, Michael Lockman, about the origins of evolution itself. And he kind of takes this perspective like things are in some stage of becoming alive. That's not the right way of putting it. Like life is kind of always about to occur in various systems that we might treat, like your rock, for instance. It's like if you could zoom out over enough time and so forth, you might see animation or the tendency towards animation in a way amongst the atoms involved in that would convince you, or watching a planet or a star, or any of these things that we just can't really perceive on our time scale, or maybe really tiny things, right? That it's always kind of happening in the background, and only does it occasionally get to the scale where it's reaches our perception level. And so we treat life and consciousness as this exception to the rule, but from his perspective, it's actually the rule, but it's just not perceptible.
Well, I completely agree with that, first of all. But let me go back to the thing about light, though. Light. So interestingly, we mentioned Rudolf Steiner a little bit before, and in Rudolf Steiner's cosmology, he definitely puts a lot of emphasis on the significance of light. But for him, the most primary phenomena is actually the feeling of warmth. And interestingly, it's like thermoception. Is that what you would call that? But feelings of warmth and coolness, because he says like that is really the most basic thing, actually, because he says your entire body is an organ of warmth perception. And so that, again, I would go way off the rails to really explain this, but he sees that as being like the most fundamental expression of animacy, interestingly, not light. But light does have an important role to play as well, because that kind of comes in on top of that. But yeah, let's kind of steer this more towards these evolutionary ideas. You mentioned that there's this kind of perspectival sense in which we might be privileging things that are more important to us as humans. Look, dogs are great. I love dogs. Dogs don't do metaphysics. Humans do metaphysics. And I think that there's definitely some value in being able to kind of look at our anthropocentrism from a bird's eye perspective, and especially insofar as we have this tendency to consider ourselves to be the only beings that are worthy of like moral value, or as these beings who have real consciousness, real animacy, and then we can look at everything else as just automata, the way that Descartes did, for example. But at the same time, I think there's a really good case to be made that the reason why we might be privileging things like light, and why our bodies might be privileging things like light, might actually be connected in some more fundamental sense. We are the tip of the evolutionary spear in a lot of ways, and so we could start talking about, like, for example, Teilhard de Chardin. If you guys are familiar with him, he was this Jesuit paleontologist, early 20th century guy. He did a lot of research in China, actually, with excavating ancient human remains and whatnot. And he developed this whole cosmology, essentially, this whole story of evolution in this book called The Phenomenon of Man. And in this book, he really goes through, I mean, everything that was known at the time. I believe he was writing this in the 1940s, but he's going through atoms and then, you know, stars and like geological transformations, and he's working his way up towards the emergence of biological life. And then he goes through the whole history of, you know, the development of these different forms that we see throughout geological history. And he ends up making this case that really, if we really take stock of what this whole evolutionary journey is doing, what it is trying to do is us. At every step of the way, you have these pieces being put into place for the actualization of man, right? And so he talks about the this process of encephalization, where you start with organisms that are very rudimentary, like the ones that we see in like the Ediacaran fauna, the Cambrian fauna. You have bilateral symmetry, but you don't have very much in the way of centralized nervous systems within like the anterior and what we could call a head. But over time, this is a very general process that occurs consistently throughout evolutionary history, is you get this centralization of a control center, for lack of a better term, in the head, and then you get the skull, and then eventually that results in the kind of liberation of the body from the water and the surface of the earth by limbs and bipedal motion. And so anyway, he goes through this whole narrative here. And ultimately, the conclusion that he comes to is that human beings have a very, very central role to play in all this. And so the reason I'm bringing this up I mean, there's all kinds of ways we could continue riffing on this, but I want to kind of bring it back before I shut up to what you were saying about light. We shouldn't discount the possibility that our minds and bodies are privileging certain things because those things actually are privileged. I think there's definitely some wisdom in being able to kind of like back up into the third person and say, well, you know, I am a human, so I think of things this way, or I am a Westerner, and so I'm preconditioned to think of things in certain ways. But those things also happen for reasons, you know, and so I don't think, even though I think that kind of contextualization is important, I don't think we should be just willing to dismiss things as simply arbitrary, if you get what I mean.
100%. And you talked about the form recognition that you get from light, which seems impeccable. And there's something about being a human where I believe we've reached this point on Earth where we can manipulate our surroundings in such an effective manner, largely because we can see. And so it's not just some arbitrary thing, right? We have these digits. I mean, they're having a hell of a time teaching these robots to do like varied tasks, right? So there's something about the interface of the hands, which can basically move in any direction they want. Really incredible little machines, whatever you want to think of them as, married to sight, which has led to everything we see, including this Zoom call right now. That can't go without notice. But at the same time, and I agree with you, I know Nasi is going to have some pushback here in a second. This is going to be awesome. That all makes sense on Earth to me, and at the scale, like the physical scale and time lengths that we experience reality, different organisms seem to experience reality at different time scales, which opens my mind up to the thought that there might be, like, for instance, my cat only lives like a quarter of the length of my life, or like a fifth of it, right? And her heartbeats are commensurate. And so I imagine her perception is also much different, and her experience on the planet. She probably has a full life just like me, but it just goes by in a different relative way. That's the way I see it. And so I imagine that at large scales, like, who the hell knows what sort of privileged entities there are. Like, have you read Star Maker by Olaf Stapledon?
I have not known.
Oh man, you would love that one. It's one of the greatest sci-fi novels of all time, at least according to Arthur C. Clarke and other people.
Say it again. What is it called?
It's called Star Maker. It was written
Maker.
back in the 30s. It's just this really crazy hallucinatory dream this guy has where he just zooms out across time and space and has this journey through the cosmos. And anyways, he basically discovers that the stars are conscious. A lot of the unexplained phenomena in physics comes down to the fact the stars are doing what they want to do. They're just doing it on a time scale that's imperceptible to us. When they do behave according to like the laws of physics that we hope most of them would behave, but don't always behave, it's because they're just being social. Like, in other words, they're not they're being pro-social, right? They're kind of doing what like is expected of them in this context, just like a school of fish swimming together, right? Like, you don't just crash into the fish next to you, but it doesn't mean that you're like held by some invisible force to each other. And it's very fascinating because it gets you to think about scale and life, and would you even notice such processes playing out were they to occur, right? It'd be very easy to mistake the universe for this dull, inanimate thing that's just proceeding according to laws. And it's like, well...
And it's just to expand on that a little bit. I think that there is a certain artifice to our experience of the animal world where, for the most part, the only time that people experience animals is something that's domesticated. Like, a dog is an extension of a long evolutionary trade-off. A cat, a horse, a cow, whatever. Like, all of these things have taken some wild animal and have subsumed it to human desires along the axis of how malleable and controllable and docile are you. And so that creates this weird sensation when looking at the animal world of like, idiots. Like, the dog depends on me completely. It's not evolved. It's barely conscious. Like, I've mentioned this all the time. Like, some guys like, my cat's like not conscious the way that I'm conscious.
You're like, you don't let it outside.
Yeah.
But basically brain dead. Like, come on.
Well, there's this hilarious video the other day that I saw of a seal in a tank at like Marine World or something, and somebody's holding a giant lizard up to the tank. And the seal clearly is like, what the fuck is that? Like, I can try to find the video. And so I'm like, okay, there is like a deep-seated animal cognition. And you can say that humans are at the tip of the evolutionary sphere. But at the same point, I look out at the vast world of nature and I'm like, there is intelligence in the trees that make up the forest, and the bees that pollinate the flowers, and the whales that sail the seas, in a way that is absolutely vital for our success as humans. And so there's this thing where it's like when we place ourselves at the tip of the spear and we pat ourselves on the back for all of the extraordinary things that we've accomplished, and the fact that it seems like the universe has conspired to create us and we will go forth and we will populate the universe. And I'm like, yes, but like, one of the greatest challenges for long distance space flight is like, you can't put humans in a sterile box. They die.
They also hate each other after a while.
Yeah, like there's something about the nature of this web that we're connected to that we take for granted because we elevate ourselves as these thinking, seeing machines that are able to create AI or whatever. But I'm like, yo, the wolf and the mole are living lives that are unfathomable to us, utterly inaccessible to us. And so I really worry that...
Perhaps happier,
yeah. Oh my God, yeah, I was going to say that. I was like, why the fuck do we have the myth of the garden? Right?
Well, a garden is a cultivated space.
The garden is a cultivated space, but it is filled with the diversity of animal creatures. Everybody gets along, everybody lives together. It's not just like Adam and Eve in a bubble in the middle of a high rise in a city, and
but it's not Adam and Eve like in a jungle or in the desert either.
No, it's like it's a place where nature is warm and welcoming, which you can argue is like an artificial location, that there's never been a time in history where you live in a place that's just fruitful and bountiful and you never have to deal with starvation. And so we've come up with this myth in order to be able to tell ourselves that once it was really good and we're sinners that deserve the punishment that we've gotten, and perhaps by aspiring to be better we shall return. And it seems like you can easily cast all of the things that we do as being an effort to return to the garden, right? Because, like, what are we after? We're after post-scarcity. Like, what is that? That's the garden. And so I'm like, the garden is a place where we live among the creatures. And I think that that's significant. And I don't think that we live among them as privileged beings necessarily. I think that we have to privilege ourselves in order to function. Like, I think that that's like absolutely, I don't think you can live without privileging yourself, because then you can't eat plants, you can't eat animals, you can't eat anything, because any action that you take is destructive. So you have to at some point have enough arrogance to be like, okay, well, I deserve to take these things. I deserve it. And yet you also have to balance it with this massive humility of like, holy shit, I couldn't even imagine doing it without the rest of it.
So first of all, I'll be sure to credit you in my upcoming publication, The High Rise of Eden. But let me give you a slightly different perspective on this. So yeah, let me just talk about the way Steiner sees this for a second, because the way he sees it is just absolutely mind blowing. So it'll take me a second, and he's going to say I'm going to say some very far out stuff on his behalf. But so he sees all of evolution as really following this, what I would describe as like a Jungian process of individuation, right? Where you have a process of separation, so like fissioning apart, division, which is followed by the concretion of boundaries and the development of a sense of agency and self-efficacy and individuality that is then followed by a kind of return, a reintegration process. And so within like Carl Jung psychology, this is like you separate from the womb, and then from the mother, and then from the family, and like you get this kind of descent process. This is the hero's journey. You're going through this gradual process of finding oneself, developing one's own sense of individuality, and eventually that has to be turned back around into a kind of reintegration. Steiner sees the entire cosmos this way. So he believes that every solar system begins as a purely undifferentiated sphere of etheric warmth, whatever that means. And it goes through this process over the eons of gradually densifying and differentiating. And so like this initial body splits off to form all the different planets and whatnot. And as life comes into play, it happens like this. Initially, the body of the Earth is fully alive. It is fully alive in the same way that everything is. But what happens here is that you get this splitting apart, and whenever this splitting apart occurs, there's that which is born, which is kind of carrying the evolutionary torch, as it were. And then there's the other part, which is left behind. And it densifies a bit. It becomes a bit more rigidified and stable, because what's happening is it is taking on the role of something foundational, that it's becoming the stage, as it were, upon which the rest of the play can be acted out. And so as the first biological organisms came to differentiate from the body of the Earth itself, the Earth itself came to kind of densify. And this is a process that would happen over and over and over again. And so you can think of it almost like a mother and child relationship, like or just parents in general. Once you have a child, you have to like stabilize, quite literally. You have to get it together because you're not the hero anymore. The kid is, right? So there's this relinquishing of what you could call a kind of privilege, I suppose, but it's really this kind of solar impulse onto the future that you're at least temporarily kind of handing over to someone else. And so the way Steiner sees it is that the entire process of evolution of the Earth has been that every step of the way, every process of splitting has been another part of the biosphere dividing itself, kind of splitting off from the line that is eventually going to become us. And so, as he sees it, the way that we should look at and we should see ourselves as privileged, but our relationship to other animals, and in fact to the actual physical body of the Earth itself, should be the relationship. It should be a relationship of responsibility, because we should see that our place at the tip of the spear is because every step of the way these other beings have made this sacrifice to make us possible. And ultimately, what's going to happen is this reintegration, where everything is going to have to be re-interwoven into a oneness that mirrors that initial, ball of etheric warmth or whatever, in the sense that there's this kind of ultimate unity which is achieved, but now it's a unity that includes difference as opposed to just being undifferentiated oneness. So anyway, obviously that requires making a whole lot of really far out propositions that all of which I definitely cannot back up. But that's how Steiner sees it anyway.
And it's hard for me to hear that and not think about two things. One, I'm going to get back to number one. Number two is the space race, though. The fact that we're kind of budding off from this planet at this point. And like, if you look at these traces of our exploration over the last 75 years or so, and depending on how space skeptical you are, it seems like, what you said about us unifying in order to pull off these enormous feats is very congruent. But there's also differentiation, because there's different cultures at this point, different nationalities going into space, and they have different projects, sometimes overlapping, sometimes not. And the other thing that I thought of was there's something really fungal about this to me, where you have this fruiting body that develops, right? And there's the potential for like a panspermic angle to this as well, which is like, I love the idea that perhaps, it's possible to imagine there being some sort of unified life to the planet before there's any biological entities, and that it has to, that it kind of gives up that identity in the form of being able to host these biological entities. But, and this isn't part of the Steiner story, but what if that life is a seed? And what if there's actually a marriage of those two forms of life, of that unified planetary life and the biological, which comes from somewhere else in the form of a little bacterial spore that plants its seed on the planet and starts the whole process over, by which it eventually blows up and shoots these fruiting bodies off into space, whether they're ultimately human beings or the product of human beings, or if the planet just gets destroyed before there's even human beings at all, and you just get the dispersion of more bacterial spores into space, which billions of years later end up on a nice little fertile life planet thing, and start the whole process over again.
Yeah, because it's like the idea that humans are privileged seems apparent. Like you said, dogs don't have metaphysics. Okay, we'll give you that. But if you think of life as something that is directional and takes a really long time, like if you look at the planet as initially being a sterile place or a quasi-sterile place, or depending on how you feel about the origin of life, whether it comes from the actual process of the rocks cooling or it comes from somewhere else, I think everybody can agree that at some point the Earth was very hot and it didn't have life on it, and then at some point it did. And the question of where did that life come from doesn't really matter, because what you have is you have a place that goes from having no life to having simple life to having complex life.
I think it'd just be, and to keep it in the Steiner frame, it might be just nice to say like the planet goes from having no organisms to having organisms.
Sure.
Because like life being this process that I think we all suspect is happening in ways other than the familiar organisms that we talk
That's
about.
why I usually say biological organisms to kind of qualify
I like
it. So,
that,
because
but-
you can say then like the whole planet itself is an organism, but anyway, yeah.
Okay, so we go from having no biological organisms to having biological organisms, and then it's the question of like, okay, well, what the hell is the point? Is it just that we're gonna be here for a while until the planet gets hit by a large enough asteroid to remelt it? The sun will go nova and sear the Earth clean and engulf it, and the entire process begins again. And it's just this exercise in, turning the wheel of suffering over and over and over again, and eternally returning to the same place? Or is the goal of the biosphere and evolution to create some kind of entity that can take the end result of all of this work? Because it's hard to see that it's not work. Every single animal all day long is working to survive. And
Except for koala bears. Those guys are fucking lazy.
I think pandas too, like, don't really do it. I think that every single panda in the world is kept alive by the like sexual ministrations of the zookeepers. Like, I don't think that they can reproduce in the wild. So there's definitely exceptions. But for the most part, the sum total of what we have in front of us is work. This is the result of eons and eons of labor. And so I'm like, if all that happens with that labor is that it is destroyed, I guess if you have a Buddhist...
Yeah, like what does Steiner imagine is the point of humanity? Like, is our job to go and colonize more worlds, to give some order to the galaxy as a whole? And then, I mean, like, yeah, is there a teleology to this Steiner?
And I guess to extend it just one more second, it's like, is there a teleology for Steiner, and are there alternatives to there being a teleology? Because I can imagine there also being a metaphysics, which is just like, no, like, we just exist for the wheel to turn, and we are simply but one phase on the wheel, and it begins and ends here, and we'll start again somewhere else, and we'll be completely divorced from everything that has been labored for here.
Well, I mean, that's the Hindu perspective. That's the wheel of samsara, but ultimately, I think that is an incomplete perspective. It's there's definitely truth in it. I mean, there is a cyclical process at work here, and I think that Hindus were completely right to see the process of cosmogenesis as this kind of dividing and separating of this primordial oneness. But I do think there's a point here, and teleology is kind of a funny word because we think of it as pointing towards a specific end goal. But again, humans are certainly part of a complication of that, because one thing that we're able to do is we're able to value. We're able to say, you know what, I like that, and we don't need to justify it. We can just be like, you know what, I like you, and I am going to try and create a world in which you and me can exist, and we can just do it. And that's not really something you see in, well, you do to a degree. I mean, animals have friends, and animals do have emotional relationships with each other and humans. But I think with the capacity to kind of, and this is my Nietzsche showing, we do have this capacity to kind of posit values in themselves that really kind of throws a gear into the more just linear understanding of teleology. But anyway, to answer the question about Steiner, the way he sees it is that ultimately all of this separation has
Sorry,
to
before
be.
you go on from that, do
Go
you
ahead.
mean that like there could be multiple, like this, like different cultures, like a culture being a almost mimetic form of values that people share and convince one another of and spread. So there could be a future to humanity which has it's multipolar. Like there's multiple paths that are taken simultaneously. Is that kind of what you're pointing at?
Yes, but I think that ultimately all of those are going to have to spiral inward. So this is something Chardin talks about. Teilhard de Chardin, he talks about there is this like metaphysical significance to the fact that the earth is a sphere, because what that sphericality necessitates is that any kind of expansion or differentiation is ultimately going to have to like return to itself. It's going to have to loop and overlap back onto itself. And so, as the way that Chardin would say this, he would say that this all of these processes of differentiation and divergence are ultimately going to have to kind of spiral into one another in some way. And so we could talk about space exploration, for example, but ultimately, I think that the possibility that human cultures are going to go off and like colonize other planets, I don't really see that as a realistic possibility. I'm going to talk about some other things here in a minute that are going to seem like even more unrealistic possibilities, so I'll go ahead and put that disclaimer there. But anyway, I think that it's one of those things where you have to be able to kind of balance on the pin this polarity of difference and unity. Like, in order for there to be difference at all, different cultures, different values, different ways of living, there has to be this kind of background of solidarity, like ontological solidarity, which can even allow for that at all. And I do think that that points towards some kind of unity of diversity. Ultimately, there has to be this way in which the ultimate end goal is not just a return to this harmonious, undifferentiated blob of oneness, right? But some kind of unity that is symphonic, harmonic, that actually like takes differences and
Like a balance of
allows them.
tensions. Like I think of that word tensegrity. Like
Yeah,
the
yeah.
stability comes from the opposition in some sense.
Yeah, because then it's dynamic, right? And this is exactly how Steiner sees it. Let me say that real quick before we go off on another topic, because you asked that a minute ago. The way Steiner sees it is that ultimately our entire solar system is one organism that is going to have to, where all the different parts, including all of the celestial bodies, by the way, the moon, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, all of it, is going to have to merge together into this like gigantic spiritual body at the end of our solar system's evolutionary process. And that's what he thinks stars are. He thinks that the sun is an embryonic star, and that when we look up at the night sky and see the other stars, that's what we're actually seeing. Most of them are these super organisms that have already completed that life cycle. So yeah, I mean, that probably sounds a lot more far out to some people than space exploration, but either way, that's how Steiner sees it. So,
I mean, I hate to be, but I'm also skeptical that this whole planetary colonization thing is going to work out also, which is why I think like the bacterial spores are probably the ones that are actually going to repopulate the next worlds, because they seem to do better in space than human beings, as far as I can tell. Hey folks, pardon the interruption. I need to remind you that this podcast is not paid for by sponsorships or ads or any other unrelated garbage. It's paid for by listeners like you. We work directly for you, and if you want to support this project, come on over to patreon.com/demystifysci and put your money where your ears are.
So we have this idea that there is a scientific approach to the world that is out there, which is kind of perplexing in the sense that what it's done is it's isolated individual phenomena and attempted to create a worldview out of individual moments in space and time that are studied extensively, that we can derive some kind of fundamental principles from, and then create stuff that works with it, right? Like, it's hard to argue that our understanding of the wavelengths of light as being the direct result of, like, the way that white light passes through a prism hasn't led to the production of television screens and printing technologies and everything else. Like, these things have been instrumentalized to a degree that has worked. However, things are kind of starting to break down in the sense that they have been instrumentalized to such a degree that they also appear to be perhaps in some way exhausted. And so that there's this other Goethean way of looking at the world from multiple perspectives, from multiple conditions, to say that there is a multiplicity of phenomena, and perhaps the multiplicity is the thing that warrants our attention rather than the individual experimental results. And it's this coming together of phenomena that produces our experience and produces the world rather than individual phenomena just kind of shining in the dark night. And from that, we take that there is something that can be learned of life, because what life is doing is somehow interacting with this, or biological organisms are interacting with this symphony of events, which leads us to ask the question of, like, well, what is the point of humans? What is the point of life? Why is it that we are the only ones on the planet that have metaphysics? What the fuck is metaphysics? Why do we do this? And then it leads us to this question of, okay, well, what is the role of humans? And in the Steinerian sense, the role of humans is, as far as I can understand it, to, like, bring forth the next phase with some larger responsibility to the cosmos because of our unique abilities. And so then that leads us to this question of, okay, well, what does that project look like? And you have this very extensive critique of transhumanism, which to me seems like the project that is attempting to fulfill the promise of humans going out and colonizing the stars, because if you have the ability to eternally repair the body, if you have the ability to eternally manipulate nature through the power of your intellect and your metaphysics, then you can live for as long as you want and do whatever you want. And why not build bases on Uranus? Like, maybe you can do it. Should you do it? I don't know. That's kind of besides the point. But I'm like, transhumanism seems to be the ideology that would allow you to fulfill the dream of humans populating the cosmos, but you have, like, a very stringent critique of it.
Well, before I say something about transhumanism, let me say something about technology here. You could say that this kind of more Goethean science has never produced any kind of smartphones or planes or satellites or anything like that. But Steiner actually did take this in a kind of technological direction, especially later in his career. He really buckled down on developing these biodynamic agriculture practices, and it was like a really big deal to him because he believed that that was the first step towards what you could call formative technologies, right? So there's mechanistic technologies, which basically just stick things together in such a way that you have these very straightforward input output conditions. When you say a machine has a mind of its own, that's not a compliment. We want our machines to be very very by the books, very, very rigid in how they function. But Steiner saw the possibility of technologies which actually acted upon kind of the next organizational level, which we could call like the metabolic, physiological, the life forces type of layer of the organization of our biosphere. And so he saw his work in biodynamic gardening as kind of the door that we could walk through into that world. And I think there are a few other pathways potentially as well, especially things with like plasma physics, like especially like Robert Temple's stuff, where he talks about plasma as this kind of like proto-biological life. And how that might factor into different kinds of technologies. But anyway, let me get to transhumanism then. The thing about transhumanism, I'm less concerned with what is technologically feasible and more concerned with the kind of inner psychological gears that are turning with an ideology like that. Throughout most of human history, I think all of human history really, there has been this impulse towards getting away from suffering. There's been this sense of alienation from the world. So Ray Kurzweil, for example, his whole project in a lot of ways originated with the untimely death of his father. And it's very clear in Kurzweil's writings that he felt betrayed by nature in a sense. The flawed fallenness of the biological body is what took my father away from me. And so he's made his whole project this kind of defiance of nature by achieving some way of immortalizing ourselves through technology. And so the thing is, that impulse has kind of always been there. There's always been this impulse to try and somehow get away from this constant maelstrom of suffering and whatnot. And we see this in virtually every religious tradition. But the thing is that up until now, pursuing that generally could only lead to a kind of realization, I think, that, or let me put it this way, it could only lead to a state of kind of spiritual development where that sense of alienation from the world broke down in some way or another. Like, you go off to your little cave in the mountains and you meditate all day, every day. And eventually you're going to come back down from the mountain like, hey, you know what? Maybe life's not so bad, right? Because that sense of being alienated, from being just kind of separated off from a dead, uncaring world, it eventually kind of dissolves away. And we kind of, it's almost like through the very process of kind of trying to depersonalize ourselves, we open up this pathway to kind of reintegrating ourselves with the world. But now with transhumanism, it's like there's now an avenue where that impulse, which Steiner would call the Luciferic impulse, can do its thing, but now it's got an actual exit door where it actually is, seemingly at least, possible to completely escape the biological body, to completely excise ourselves from this natural world that we so often feel ourselves to be betrayed by. And so what ends up happening here, I think, is this. We end up being driven by this sense that the world is fallen, the world is grotesque, the world doesn't care about us, right? And so we dream up this puffy cloud heaven within this virtual hyperspace that we're going to try and put ourselves in. And escaping the planet, is often very times part of this narrative too, this idea of, oh, well, the Earth is just this cooling rock out floating in space, and eventually the sun's going to gobble it up and we're all going to die. So we need to go to, some exoplanet so that we can create some kind of Eden there. And it's the same thing. It's this idea that we are just these wandering nomads in a world that just doesn't care about us. And I think that even beyond what is or is not technologically feasible, there's a deeper question here about, like, what would be the end goal of that? Like, would we really be alive anymore? Would we really be human anymore if we were just uploaded into these like giant supercomputers that are like buried, in the ground and cooled by liquid nitrogen? Like, is that really being alive? Just because you don't have to die per se, just because you can have all of your weird fetishes satisfied by the internet at any time, like, I think like if we're able to really kind of reacquaint ourselves with pain and suffering and death in a way that these things feel less hostile, then that whole transhumanist mission itself starts to seem like something very grotesque and very dehumanizing, quite literally.
It's funny because you're like, would that really be alive? And I think the Miltonian answer is like, no, you just made yourself the king of hell, basically.
Yeah.
Like you literally have accomplished the worst possible dominion imaginable. It's this like false representation of reality that you're the master of all of a sudden. And it's like, it's so funny that it's so weird that people have been telling this story for at least hundreds of years. But um,
But don't you think that that's a reflection that every single time we have some kind of technological innovation or change, even if it's just the natural flow of generations where somebody's like, well, we've always made plows this shape, but what if we try this new shape? And everybody, if you take this Steinerian arc, which the previous generation solidifies, while the next generation is this kind of more etheric, aerial innovator, then the previous generation is always like, no, you're going to be damned. You're going to go to hell. This is the worst thing that you could possibly do. This is how we do things. And so we tell these stories because it is the mechanism by which the older conservative generation is attempting to prevent the new generation from altering the things that have always worked. And
I don't think it's about tools though. Like I think that like I don't think it's about progress or technological progress or anything like that. Right? It's about this vision that you can do better than nature. That's a very separate ideal that I think has reared its head multiple times in the past.
my argument is that every single human innovation, from the first moment that we made shoes to the first moment that we killed an animal and wore its skin to the first moment that we made a house, is us saying that we can do better than nature. And that tension has existed within us from the very first stirrings of whatever it meant to be human. Because Shiloh and I have talked about this before, where it's like, where does this myth come from where it's things were always good? And I wonder if if there isn't a form of this proto myth in animals as well, where they're like, there was once a time where there were enough acorns and the squirrels filled the land and there was.
Well, it's not better than nature. Sorry, it's better than God. Like I just like trying to avoid bringing God into this, but like God is like God's a symbolic representation of the ideal, right? And so it's like, can you beat the ideal?
Well, God, I mean, if we're gonna bring God into this, right? And so, okay, we have this, sky, figure, beard, clouds, whatever else.
No,
I mean,
not
you can
that.
say the universe, you can say like whatever
No,
it
it's the
is.
ideal good, right?
It's
It's
the
the
ideal
ideal
good.
behavior in some sense.
So I'm like, the way that you were born in this world is wet, screaming, and naked. And everything and every other animal is born into this world, and you see a gelding come into the world and it's running. Like it lands literally on its feet. And so the idea that we are not foundationally fucking with what nature made us like is hard for me to wrap my head around because I'm like, where do we draw that line of what kind of technologies are okay and what kind aren't? Because I've met lots of people that are like, the invention of agriculture was a mistake. Like it ruined humans forever. And I'm like, well, that's a perspective, and you can argue strongly that perspective because it creates these really complex societies, it creates hierarchies, it creates states, it creates wars on unprecedented scales. Like all of these things come from a technological innovation. And so where do you draw that line of what kind of technological innovation in a Miltonian sense goes against God?
Well, I would say that the ultimate destiny of humanity, according to Steiner and Chardin and myself, is to reshape the world. We're able to do that for a reason, I would say. I don't think that technological artifice itself is some kind of evil. It's not that. It's more specific than that, I would say. It's the idea that it's really the fetishization of machine technology, I think, that is really the kernel here for this kind of transhumanist idea, because it's not just like, oh, well, we can make the human body better. Oh, well, I mean, we already do that. We already have modern medicine. We already have, I mean, even before modern medicine, I mean, we've always had medicinal practices. We've always had these little hacks with
Just eating good
alchemy
food,
and
right? Like
herbs,
exercise or
or
whatever.
just eating better food. You know, like all kinds of things that there are all kinds of ways that we can do better than just what we would do if we were just screaming and naked in the woods. That's not really in question here. But what is in question is this idea that, like, biological composition itself is fundamentally flawed in a way that machinery is not, because machinery can be designed in a top-down way, right? So Kurzweil's ideal, the way he sees it, is, okay, biological bodies are put together by natural selection, which is a blind watchmaker. It is stupid. It just does whatever to create these vehicles for replicating genes. And therefore, the only reason we have to die is because evolution is stupid. And machines don't have to die because we're not stupid. So if we could just migrate our consciousness into some sort of machine that we could continually repair over and over again, then bada bing, bada boom, we get the best of both worlds. We get to be consciousnness and enjoy our weird, cloud porn, and we don't have to die. Yay. Like, there's several leaps there between, like, oh, like, we can do better than just like getting eaten by wolves in the woods, and then that, like, and I think the line, if we want to draw a line, it's this idea that biological bodies, organisms, really are just ontologically the same as machines. It's the same kind of organization, just worse, because it was built in this haphazard way for the purpose of replicating genes. And I don't think that's true. I think that mechanical organization, like I kind of sort of mentioned this a minute ago, mechanical organization is all about inputs and outputs, and having a consistency between those things. You want your machines to do the same thing every time. You want, when you pull the lever for the thing to raise exactly, a meter or whatever, like it's this very input output kind of thinking. Organisms just do not work that way. I think there is this kind of top down formative causation at work in the way that organisms operate. And so this could get us into, like, Michael Levin's work with, like, these bioelectric fields, or Rupert Sheldrake's ideas. And I think there's a lot of different things that point to this idea that within these truly organic dynamic systems, there is a kind of holistic causation that is not the same as purely, like, bottom up mechanical causation. And so I frankly just do not believe that if Ray Kurzweil was able to actually simulate his father with some kind of AI, that his father would be there. I mean, maybe in some very dim sense that, maybe if we're imagining, like, fields of consciousness that can instantiate themselves in different ways, then maybe, but I don't see it. I think that, I really hope Ray Kurzweil does not manage to actually achieve his vision, because if he does, he's just going to kill himself, and probably a whole bunch of other people in the process too, and also create these really grotesque parodies of human beings, which are essentially just chatbots. And yeah, I think that's a little bit different than creating a slightly different shaped kind of plow.
I mean, it is, and I just, God, there's so much in there. I think that the most superficial thought that I have, which is a little dystopian, is that I can imagine a condition where the reason that Kurzweil can't recreate his father is because a lack of holistic data about who his father is, where what he has is he has his writings, and he has letters, and he has these very point-like representations of who his father was. But you can also imagine a different condition where, let's say, a parent signs up for a service for their child at the very beginning of their life, where the child just carries a recorder with them for their entire life. And that recorder is integrated with their cell phone, with their computer, and so what it's capturing is not a one-off point here and there, having to extrapolate between the way that the person wants to represent themselves externally, but is in fact actually taking the totality of the person and then sticking it into a model. And I'm like, I actually think that at that point, it would be much harder to differentiate between have we recreated the person or not. Like the weird uncanny valley would probably be much farther away.
I mean, you might simulate them effectively so that it passes the Turing test, but I don't know if that thing's gonna. I really doubt that thing's having experiences at that point.
I'm not saying that it's having experiences. I'm just saying that I think that you would have the ability to recreate that mess of information in such a way that it would be indistinguishable as you talked to
That's
it.
basically already happened.
I don't know. I think that most of the chat programs that have tried to recreate people, you can still really clearly see the fuzzy, far off boundaries where there is some domain in which it's a really good simulation and then it falls off. But and that's creepy. Like I think that there's something about that where I'm like, I don't think that that's a thing that we should do. I don't like that.
I think that no matter how believable it might seem superficially, what you're going to actually be talking to is a digital voodoo doll. And I feel like that's going to have all kinds of really weird and not good psychological after effects that we're not taking into consideration right now. And I mean, well, we can already see this. I mean, people have like AI girlfriends, and that is like just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, can you imagine if someone was actually able to believably reproduce their grandma on their phone? Like dealing with death and having to come to terms with that is very difficult. It's a tragedy, but can you imagine a world in which we've created this fantasy land where we can literally just pretend that death isn't real until we're on its door?
Maybe your grandma's not even dead yet, by the way, and you just want to you hate your grandma, so you want a better version of her, so you're like, I'll just hang out with my digital grandma instead. And like you don't actually end up like you could do that ad infinitum at its limit to every single problem that you experience on Earth. Like the most obvious one to me is porn, really. It's like, all right, so you can like digitally simulate an experience that is like your fundamental driver in life, pretty much. Like it is literally the payoff you get for being alive, as far as I can tell. Like you basically get this like hit of heroin in the brain naturally from an experience where you have to be brought together under the most intensely intimate circumstances with another being. And it's like, nah, we can just simulate that now for free. Like it's crazy. And so if you apply that to all of these different aspects of life, like, yeah, you can fake your way through the whole thing. But I guess I'm just trying to understand like why it's so, I feel like we're all disturbed by the transhumanists.
Except for the transhumanists.
I know. Yeah, everybody in this room, sorry. But I'm trying to understand exactly what it is that freaks me out. And I think it's the neglect of reality that results from it.
Well, I think that it's a speciation event. Like, I think that you're looking at a group of people that are not going to be really human at some point. Like,
there can only be one.
It's explicit in the liner notes of the project.
It's in the name. Like,
yeah.
they don't want to party with us anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, I think that it's kind of, maybe it's this feeling of rejection. Maybe it's the feeling of uncertainty where you're like, okay, well, if you do merge with the machines, it seems likely that won't end well for the rest of us who choose not to. Like, it's hard for me to imagine that the transhumanist movement does not have some kind of violence inherent in it, against those that choose not to become transhuman.
Yeah, I mean, they could definitely see those who nope out of it as a kind of dangerous detriment. Because, I mean, as far as they're concerned, everything is at stake, right? Like, they don't want to die. And if you're not on board, then you're making it more likely that they will. I mean, I could definitely see some kind of religious fanaticism coming out of that. But let me go back to the porn thing real quick, because I actually think this is important. Because the thing about like actual real sexuality is that it requires this kind of ultimate vulnerability from human beings, where you do have this kind of rendering permeable of these kind of psychological boundaries that are normally much more rigid. And I think that does facilitate a kind of, I want to say, liberation in a way, a kind of like self-transcendence, at least a little drop of it, as it were. I mean, there's something like deeply spiritual about actual sexuality, and I do think it is to the detriment of Western spiritual traditions that they have tended to neglect that so much. But anyway, if you're getting all of that out of a freaking box, you don't have to be vulnerable. You don't have to let down your guard. You don't have to deal with the fact that there's another person that can like judge you. They like there's no.
And you might really need judgment. Like that might be really good for you, actually.
Right,
like,
exactly.
It's like you don't want to do it, but it might be really good for you and everybody you know, and blah blah blah.
Yeah, like everything challenging about that is good for us. And so the idea that you could just take all of that away and just have the damn heroin, like we know what happens, because we know what happens to people who get addicted to heroin. It's not pretty.
Yeah, I still see it as really just being especially a neglect of reality, especially as that transhumanist ideal is capturing a lot of the more wealthy people on the planet, and you see the wealth being accumulated in fewer and fewer hands, then you have the opportunity for this ideology that is deeply neglectful of the reality, the real natural reality of the earth, and that most people are experiencing because they can't buy into the transhumanist agenda even if they wanted to. And so you have this bizarre abandonment of the world.
It is really categorically different from anything that's happened before, right? Because we've had billionaires before, we've had massive inequality between people before, but there is always the sense that we are equal on some level before the sacrificial altar of nature, which is that we will all grow old, we will all die. And now it seems, I think about the billionaires, and it seems plausible to me that we have entered the phase where some of these people might live to be 200 years old, maybe 300 years old, maybe 400. Like, I don't know. Like the promise of transhumanism does not seem impossible to achieve, and that's a weird thing to consider because I'm not sure that that's ever happened before.
I think we're conflating two things right now. Like, one is the machine world. I think that Kehlan's talking about, like, you preserve yourself in a machine going forward, and the other is that you like repair your body indefinitely.
But I think that both of those lead. Okay, so let's unpack that. Is there a difference between a biologically based transhumanism and a machine based transhumanism?
I think a biologically based transhumanism would have to be something categorically different, I think, because in order for that, so like actually in the comments section of my video on transhumanism, a number of people brought up Michael Levin's stuff with like regenerative medicine and whatnot. I could see how maybe that could also open up some very dangerous possibilities, but I don't see it as ideologically driven in the exact same way. It does seem to be a bit different. I would be reluctant to call that transhumanism because it's not trying to escape from biology. And furthermore, So let's say that we could develop some kind of, what does he call them, xenobots or whatever that could allow us to fight cancer and repair our telomeres or whatever the case may be. We can live a little bit longer. Cool, great, whatever. That I don't think is necessarily bad. It could create a kind of inequality, though, for sure. Like what you mentioned, if you've got like ultra wealthy people living to 150 while the rest of us are like dying at a regular age, that's going to definitely raise some ethical questions, to put it mildly. It's definitely going to call into or cast into much starker contrast just what the distribution of resources actually looks like. But on top of that, I don't really see that kind of thing ever resulting in like genuine immortality. And this is a little bit iffier because I am just kind of going on intuition here. But when we look at organisms that are genuinely immortal, these are organisms where like they're much more undifferentiated generally, and also the boundaries between individuals are way more blurry. Like with hydras and planarians, they're all clones of one another. That's why they can live forever, because regenerating their own bodies is no different than reproducing. It's the same thing to them. Humans are never going to be like that, and I think that's significant. I'm not entirely sure why, in terms of like the physiological minutia there, but I'm pretty sure that's the line that even like regenerative medicine isn't going to be able to cross. There's something about the fact that reproduction for us is not just cloning, and rebuilding our bodies is not just cloning either. There's more at work there in terms of the memory of the body and its individuality that has to be kind of preserved. So anyway, yeah, I'll leave it at that, I guess, because I'm not entirely sure how to go any further there. I think it has something to do with that, though, something to do with this distinction between individuality and cloning.
Yeah, it seems like there's something motivational if we want to come at it from an evolutionary perspective. Like the fact that we're going to die seems to put greater value on the actions that we take and forces us to really consider what we do with our time. I often wonder about that, like just as a thought experiment, if you weren't going to die, like, would you still, like, would you get up in the morning? I mean, like, would you, right? Like, I don't know. I always feel a little bit of a clock over my head, like 100% of the time, though, especially the older I get. And I'm like not that old yet, but I'm not a spring chicken anymore either. And it's like every single day I have a finite amount of tasks or experiences that I can do, and I have a finite amount of days, and I can actually calculate how many I on average most statistically likely have, and it's not that many. So it's like there's something about that really forces the crystallization of your intentions in a way that I feel like might not be there, and that's perhaps the reason that it's evolved. I guess the reason that it's hard to not bring God into all of these things is because when biologists talk about evolution, they have just made a new God. Like, you can call it whatever the hell you want, but there's a force at work, and it might be natural selection, or it might be electrostatics, or like whatever you want, but there are forces at play that are guiding us through this world. And so I just don't know that you make a lot of purchase by throwing God in the trash can. Like, I just think that that's a symbolic representation of something that certainly seems to be playing out. And like, you can give it new names and stuff, but it's very hard to have these conversations about shoulds, like, should we all become machine bots in the future or not, without considering something akin to these mythological propositions that our ancestors have been propagating for thousands and thousands of years, which are these mythological god stories. And I don't think that they're superstitious idiots. Like, I think they're onto something. And yeah, I just have a hard time like getting away from that. And I'm not, of any particular, I don't think any particular religion has like nailed the proper way to discuss God or something. But people have been trying and trying and trying and trying. And just the fact that, of course, our technological civilization has come up with evolution and the Big Bang, and they've scientificized a lot of these patterns and forces. I don't think that it's really gotten us any closer to being able to understand the shoulds of the situation.
Well, especially because the should is inherently divorced from a material world. What does it mean to say that an organism that is purely material should or shouldn't do something? Like, where does should even come from? Like that's an inherently moral statement, right?
Well, ultimately, I think in order to actually coherently address a question like that, there's no way around it. You have to start thinking about why there is a reality at all. I mean, we can get bogged down on the minutia of like, okay, different cultures have different values and whatever, but okay, if we're going to actually be able to say something coherent about that beyond just saying, well, we do things this way and you do it that way, and I guess we all just have to get along or kill each other. I mean, because at that point, like, which one's better? Who knows? Let's try killing each other. See, maybe we'll like that better. But I think we can zoom out here, and we can think about what it takes to generate a cosmos. I mean, I am very firmly in and I hate the isms, of course, but you could call me like an idealist or a panpsychist or whatever the hell. I believe that animacy is fundamental to being itself, and that at some point, well, I shouldn't say at some point, I think that pervading reality, there is this underlying impulse, which I think you could call a will to existence. Even Richard Dawkins calls it that. I mean, he thinks that it's just a matter of replicating genes, but it is there, and I don't think it's just an implicit poetic turn of phrase. I think there is a genuine impulse towards something, and I don't think that something is a specific goal. I think that something is a kind of experience. And I think this refers back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. We were talking about like the nature of light and color and all that, and music. The integration of diversity into unity is, I believe, the experience of beauty, the experience of numinosity, and that, if we take what Steiner's saying seriously, and I think he's right about it, at the very least this part, that our universe really is this cosmic fractal of some sort that is constantly undergoing these cycles of separation and reintegration to create difference and then create unity from that difference, then it appears to be that is the engine of being itself. And actually, let me nail this down in a more concrete way. So I've been doing a lot of research lately regarding trauma and the effects of trauma on human beings and the human brain in particular. There is this band of different brain regions. There's a number of them. I don't know if this has a specific scientific terminological designation, but I've heard it described as the Mohawk of selfhood, and it's this band of regions that goes right across the center of the top of the brain, the cerebral cortex, and in people who have survived very intense trauma, and there are different kinds of responses to trauma, but one of them is depersonalization. And in studying the brains of people who have become depersonalized through trauma, what researchers have found is that those brain regions tend to become far less active. And so what this seems to be doing then is it is deterritorializing, let's say, the sense of selfhood, but it is also mitigating pain. it is making it so that these people are literally less sensitive to pain, and actually just less sensitive in general. In one of the books I was reading recently, it was talking about how some of the patients who were studied in this research, you could put like a key or a marble in their hand with a blindfold on them, and they could not tell you what was in their hand because they were literally more desensitized by that depersonalization. And so what that seems to be telling us is that those brain regions are very involved in achieving unity from diversity. That's why they're in the middle of the brain. It's because they have this very significant role to play in taking the multiplicity that is human consciousness and weaving it together into a unity. And as you shut that down, experiences quite literally become less intense across the board, because there is this relationship there between the unification of diversity and the intensity of experience. And ultimately, I think that is what our universe is doing. It is trying to achieve the ultimate feeling of experiential intensity.
Damn. Yeah, I mean that's what sex is too, right? Like we were talking about
Yeah.
before. Literally like taking two extremely different perspectives, right? The masculine and the feminine is just about, men are, what is it? Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Like we're very different experiences on almost everything. And then you unify them in this instant, essentially. And of course, your biological reality rewards you as best as it possibly can for that experience. And it's almost like every single experience that is transcendent or profound or rewarding in some sense is merging these diversities into this unified moment. It's kind of blowing my mind. I love how you put that.
And so
Thank you.
I mean, I haven't thought of this recreation of a self or this unity before in this way. And so I agree with Shiloh that I think that it's really beautifully put. But where does the should fall out from this?
Oh, I did want to mention one more thing. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
You were talking earlier, you said like there's this kind of assumption on the transhumanist part that evolution is dumb. And I think that's really funny because in the Miltonian sense, God is dumb, right? And I don't think that evolution is too much different than God in terms of like the hand of God, or like the actions of the universe, or whatever you want to say. And that's a really interesting mistake, I think, to assume that the background forces that have propelled us to this point are without intention. And it's funny because you said you didn't believe that necessarily that intention was teleological in nature, but it does I think there's a difference between intention and like planned outcome in some ultimate sense, right? And that's what's kind of baffling about if you just talk about the long-term future of humanity or of the cosmos or anything else. It's like, well, it doesn't really make sense that it would have an ending per se, like that there's just this day where it's like, all right, we're done here. Yeah. Like, and we all just kind of like congratulate each other, and I don't know what happens at that point, right? So you can't think of endpoints with a lot of this stuff, but that doesn't rule out the intentionality of the actions that unfold in the midst of, in the backdrop of that wandering. I don't know. God, where am I going with this?
Well, I think if I can piece it together, I think that your intentionality inherently has a should component
Yeah,
to
yeah,
it,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so when I watched your transhumanism presentation, Keelan, I was struck by the idea that I don't think you ever explicitly said this, but it felt like what you were moving around was the idea that biology is somehow ensouled. And so that drives the intentionality of the biological organism. And machines are inherently soulless. And so there is no should that is possible inside of a machine world, because it's like, well, you're not bordered by what you should do. You're now driven by what is possible, what you can do. And these are very, very different categories of action.
Well, what I said before is that there is, I think, a very real categorical distinction between mechanical and organismic organization. Now, when we're talking about ensoulment, though, then I think that's a bit more specific, actually, because then I think this really brings us into what I was saying earlier about the ability to kind of posit values. There's somehow a connection there between a sense of separate identity and that capacity. Somehow those are interrelated with one another, because with animals, I'd say there's something you could describe as soul going on. Certainly they have consciousness, I believe. They have experiences, they have emotions, they have preferences even. I don't think that they have this sense of selfhood that kind of creates this feeling of a boundary between an internal and external world, though. And I think that's very significant here, because that, I believe, is actually the core of what we think of as our soul. Like when we think the thought I, what is that pointing to? It's pointing to this idea that there is this whole other world inside of me that's not just perfectly continuous with everything else. I don't think animals have that necessarily. I feel like for animals, you have something that's more like this kind of non-dual state of consciousness, which humans can achieve, by the way, where there's not really a sense of this division between internal and external. But that inner space, once it opens up, it does a number of different things. One of them is that sense of alienation and anxiety that we humans feel, that sense of existential dread that we could be swallowed back into the world upon death. But it also creates a kind of canvas that we can begin to paint on, and that is this kind of agency we have that I don't think animals do. So I the way you want to finagle the terminology here is maybe a bit ambiguous, but I think we can at least say that human beings are much more intensely ensouled than anything else in the world, and there's a correlation between that and our ability to posit values. So back to the should thing, then we can, I think, definitively posit a cosmic should, and that is something like what I described as this will to being or will to numinosity. But there's a lot of ambiguity there. Like, there's a lot of different ways you can do that, and nature, for the most part, is kind of driven by things outside of itself. Like the dog's will to survive and reproduce does not come from this internal canvas that it's painting on. It kind of comes from outside, in the sense that the dog's instincts and drives and the different processes at work in its body are not coming from a sense of self-agency. They're just kind of given to the animal in a way. That's not necessarily the case for us, and this is why it's possible for us to even be like, should, could, would, is, ought. We can juggle that, because we do have that sense of a distinction between an internal and an external world. But I think what we can do here is this: we can say, all right, are the values we are positing, are those actually in accordance with this more fundamental will to being that preconditions that, or are they not? Because if they are, then we can start talking about, can these different values be reconciled with one another? Can we have some kind of solidarity here? How does this play into this bigger symphony that we're a part of? But if they don't, I mean, there's only one other option. If it's not the will to being, then you've got a will to nothingness. You've got something that is eventually going to turn into something basically suicidal. And I think that's exactly what transhumanism is. Its denial of the biological world is, I think, stemming from a much deeper denial of existence itself. And we see this. There are examples of this. There's the within the Buddhist, Japanese Zen Buddhist tradition, you have this practice that is called, and I'm going to definitely mispronounce this, but I believe it's called Shoka Sembutsu. If you guys have heard of this, it's a process of self-mummification. by which these Zen monks, it's been illegal for a very long time, but they would quite literally mummify themselves alive in this attempt to escape samsara and achieve nirvana. And I think that's what you have here when you have values that are antithetical to being itself. That's where you get true evil, because that's just not compatible with the symphony. That is a force that's just going to try to eat everything in a desperate effort to extricate itself from existence.
The mummification process is crazy. I think they eat like pine pitch and like all these desiccating substances, and they don't drink anything over the course of many, many months, if not years, and eventually just kind of go into stasis. It's really super creepy. Shiloh, what do you have?
I mean, I'm trying to tie together the what do we say? The intention of the universe, the hand of God, the should of beings, in opposition to evil, and so like how you would define evil in the absence of those things, and I think Kehlan just put it down as that which works against being. But there's something about being that involves freedom as well, because some of the best, the most robust definitions that I've seen that don't really require cultural context for what is good and what is bad are essentially actions that respect the consent of the other person in the transaction. And so there's something about restricting one's freedom that ultimately plays into this discussion as well. But would you agree with that? The freedom to pursue that diversity of experience or something, and getting in the way of it would somehow be antithetical.
Right. Yeah. There's definitely. So let's actually back this up a little bit. So let's start from just that most primordial feeling of being adult, of being something that is therefore in some mysterious way distinguished from a world. The first breath of air that the baby experiences after birth. That immediately creates this tension of now you've got this membrane between self and world, and that creates this kind of primal existential anxiety. I think that we do see this expressed in the brain, but I think this is deeper than brains. I think this is deeper than biology. I think this is very like much a cosmic principle here, because what happens is that sense of anxiety is the sense that, okay, this world that I once felt myself to be continuous with is now different than me. And so I have a sense of internal control that is now contrasting with a sense of external not control. Like this is a world that could eat me now. These boundaries are creating this immense tension, but they're also keeping me safe. I have to preserve these boundaries. I have to keep this body going, or otherwise I'm going to dissolve back into the dirt and get eaten by the worms. And so that fundamental anxiety can manifest in, I believe, 3 ways. And I think this is perfectly in accordance with what Rudolf Steiner says. Rudolf Steiner would call this the Ahrimanic impulse, the Luciferic impulse, and the Christic impulse. So the Luciferic is what I think we see in the Shokisembutsu practice, the self-mummification. It's what we see in transhumanism. We see it in different ways throughout a number of different spiritual traditions, this will to extricate oneself from reality through some kind of escapism or self-deification or whatever. And so that's a will to escape effectively. Then on the other side of that, you've got what Steiner would call the Ahrimanic impulse, which is like, oh, okay, world, you're different than me. You're a threat to me. I'm going to eat you. And quite literally, it is this will to control and dominate and consume. I think we see this expressed at this kind of transpersonal level within capitalism, within globalism, within colonialism. within imperialism of any sort. This
What was the word that you used? Ahrimanic?
Ahrimanic. It's a term that he's
Ahrimanic.
deriving from Zoroastrianism, because that was like the evil deity in the Zoroastrian tradition. But anyway,
Which just means to like consume in order to overcome.
That's how Steiner saw it. Within Zoroastrianism, it's like a darkness of light, or a god of darkness, and then you've got this god of like fire and light, which is Ahura Mazda, and so those are like the God and Satan of the Zoroastrian tradition. But it's a will to dominate effectively. And then in the middle of that, then you have what Steiner would call the Christ stream, or the Christ impulse. And that for him essentially amounts to this will to actually participate in the universe and actually try to create unity from diversity, to actually, be here, show up for it. And the thing is, if you look at those two kind of evil, quote unquote, impulses, if you took either of them to their logical extreme, like if there was absolutely nothing hindering the Ahrimanic impulse, what would it eventually do? I mean, think about what capitalism, for example, would do to the planet if there was nothing stopping it. It would turn everything into capital. It would turn everything into machines. It would create this homogeneous oneness, and it wouldn't stop. It would create spaceships, it would fly off, and it would mine the asteroids, and it would turn everything in the world into what Heidegger would call standing reserve. Keep going with that thought. Like, where would it end? Eventually, it would end at a kind of total control where there's nothing unexpected. Everything is completely within the purview of one central locus of homogenizing power, where there is only oneness effectively. And if you really think about, like, what would that be at its utmost extreme? It would be nothingness. It would be completely undifferentiated. It would be indistinguishable from non-being. And with the Luciferic, it's the exact same thing. The Luciferic attempts to really arrive at the same destination through a slightly different path, which is some kind of spiritual liberation from reality. But you end up at the exact same place. You end up at this merging back into this completely abyssal oneness. That's what the Shokisembutsu is trying to achieve. It's trying to achieve liberation from samsara by basically annihilating oneself back into this state of completely undifferentiated satori.
Yeah, I think it's crazy too that the baby is kind of this incredible symbol of all of these potentialities playing out, right? It's like, what's literally the worst crime that you could imagine for a human being doing? It's like killing a baby, because the baby represents all of these possibilities, right? And so it's like, it's interesting that symbol is at the heart of the Christ story too, because from what I hear you saying, it's almost like this Christ story is like, yeah, like the baby's gonna die, first of all, that sucks, but it's still worth it because it's gonna go and have all of these experiences and like ultimately lead to more babies, and like this chain's gonna keep rolling. And it's interesting because the sort of escape from that is like this kind of shitty attitude you hear from people sometimes, like, and I'm like, no, I'm a little like pot kettle black here because I don't have children myself, but I hear it, but it's not because I like think that it's a bad idea to not have children, right? And there is this weird attitude that has that.
To have children.
Shit, what'd I say?
To not have children.
Yeah, there's this weird attitude that people express where it's like it's bad to have children because life is difficult and painful and all of this stuff, right? And that has the escape vibe to it, whereas the I'm gonna screw up this word, Ahrimanic, yeah. Ahrimanic, that impulse would be like to stomp the baby out or something like that. But they both effectually result in the cessation of proliferation of this ability to bring together diverse experiences and to synthesize them in some transcendent fashion that constitutes what it means to be.
Would it be to stomp the baby out, or would it just be to stick the baby into a machine where it has no real choice and simply must obey the will of the system that it becomes a
Well,
part
that
of.
would be phase one, right? Phase one is stomp out individuality, stomp out anything that could possibly threaten the machine, as it were. But eventually, like, if again, like I was saying, if you can really, like, we would never see this in the real world, I don't think. But if you could really imagine that taken to its ultimate extreme, any kind of difference, any kind of divisions between things, all diversity is going to be seen as a threat to that kind of locus of power, which is trying to just further itself as far as it can possibly go. And so, yeah, I mean, if the machine could just stomp out all the babies and just replace them with AI or whatever, yeah, it would do it. But even beyond that, eventually it would stomp out the AI and replace it with nothing if it could just get to a point where it was the only thing that existed anymore and everything was just swallowed up into it somehow.
I mean, I think that what Shiloh's driving at with this idea that reproduction and the child and the Don Hoffman calls it this like the portal of consciousness. And the idea that there's something about creating these portals and sending them into the world to encounter life and to wrestle with it and to figure out some way to transmute it into something that is more than giving up according to one of these two poles, that seems like the inherently valuable thing. It's like to find something that is new and interesting and innovative and different than what came before. And I feel like if your goal is this quote unquote Luciferian one, where it is to completely remove yourself from the system, you have not fulfilled on that should. It is not a will to being, it is a will to absence, right? And then the Ahrimanic version is to refuse to innovate. And I think that being requires innovation. It requires doing something different than the person before you did, because you run into, if we take it into an evolutionary stance, you kind of run out of space inside of an evolutionary niche. Somebody's already there. They're already eating the thing that you want. And you don't want to spend all of your time competing with that person. And so you're like, okay, well, I'm going to do something slightly different that allows me to focus less on this competitive instinct and more on something else. And so I think that your observation about this is really.
I'm dying to know if there's two paths away from being, are there two paths to being?
So the way Steiner describes it is the being is kind of the center, and you've got those other two impulses inevitably kind of spiral around it and into it. This is why we never see like literally unrestrained Ahrimanic or Luciferic, because if we did, it would be like a black hole swallowing the entire universe. Like everything would just collapse into itself.
We usually
But
kill
then
those people, it seems like, historically.
yeah, right.
I mean, like, that's what the justice system is, from what I understand. Historically, much more killing in the past than now, but still, in the United States, there's plenty of states that will kill people who are just outright
We haven't
evil.
really figured out a different thing to do. Like when you see somebody who's like murdering children or serial killing or just committing horrific crimes that they're totally unrepentant for.
There's an enforced spiraling.
Yeah.
For spiraling, you got to do what you got to do, right? Actually, let me. I know we've been going for a while, but let me tell this real quick, because I think this kind of puts a nice cap on this part of the discussion. Have you guys ever, by any chance, read the book "The Lathe of Heaven" by Ursula K. Le Guin? Nope. You should, because it's very short. It's very entertaining. It's great. The narrative of The Lathe of Heaven it's kind of a sci-fi novel, but it starts with this character. His name is Or, like O-R, but anyway, he realizes that he has this power to change the world through his dreams. And so he'll like go to sleep and he has a dream, and there'll be like some kind of modification of the world, and he wakes up and it changes the world. So it's like, and it can even happen retroactively, like, oh, somebody else won World War II or whatever, or something like that. He's changing the world through his dreams. And he starts taking like drugs to try and keep himself awake because he's afraid that he's going to like mess up the world. And ultimately, he ends up in this like rehab clinic, and this psychiatrist gets a hold of him. His name is Dr. something, whatever. Anyway, the psychiatrist realizes that this is actually real, that this person actually is changing the world with their dreams somehow. And so he devises this machine that can basically put this guy to sleep, and he can use this kind of subliminal messaging to get the guy to dream certain things because he's trying to use this person to change the world with their magical dreams, right? And he's like, well, I want there to be world peace. And so he has this person, watch the thing, and he falls asleep. He dreams that there's world peace, and then like aliens come and attack. It's like it becomes one of these kind of comical self-fulfilling prophecy things at first, where like all of his wishes like come true, but in this like really kind of topsy-turvy way where it's actually horrible. But it keeps going, and eventually he gets frustrated, and he has or dream that they call it effective dreaming was a power that the psychiatrist had and not or the patient. And he does this, and so the dreaming gets transferred to him. And so he goes to sleep, and he starts trying to dream the world into a state of ultimate perfection. And so Or, now the protagonist of the story, he's trying to get to this guy, the psychiatrist, as the world itself is like breaking down, as this guy is trying to dream it into a state of like ultimate perfection. And it's like all of the people turn gray because he wants racism to stop, and like all of the natural environment goes away because that's dangerous, and so everything turns into these like perfect tiles. And ultimately, at the end of the story, what happens, he doesn't really stop this guy. What ends up happening is it all just collapses in on itself. And at the end of the story, the patient, or the world somehow gets reverted back to normal, and he finds the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist is in like a straitjacket in a mental asylum. And that's like how the story ends. So anyway, that's Ursula K. Le Guin. She says it's a very Taoist story because the way that she sees it, that is kind of like the antithesis. Like that's the anti-Tao, is this idea of like trying to perfect reality. You could see this as kind of the Luciferic or the Ahrimanic, or kind of both, right? That our ideals of perfection, when they're very like egoic in this way, if you really did take them to their ultimate extreme, like you would kind of just end up turning the world into gray goo. So anyway.
Yeah, it's always the second and third order effects that we just can't conceive of when we develop these new technologies too. It's like, come up with a medicine, and it's like, medicine's great, but then it's like, oh, well, it's
summoning demons.
Yeah, it's doing God knows what, or polluting the environment in this weird way, and everybody's drinking your medicine from your pee that's supposed to be screened out in the river upstream, and it's just like there's so many seconds. It's even like that's what like freaks me out when people start talking about like how we're gonna stop the Earth from getting hot or something. Like, well, we'll just put stuff in the atmosphere, and it's like, well, what's that gonna do to everything else? Like, okay, you solved one problem, but you made 20 more. And it seems to be a real feature, not a bug, of our innovative processes.
And it seems, and I have no historical evidence for this, but it seems like moments of this leap in ability are probably moments where there is a lot of reignition that changes the spiritual landscape, where I think that people start to ask, okay, this is the landscape of possibilities of what we can do, and now what is it that we should do? And I think that this is where all of this ends up at, which is that there is a symphony out there. We are all listening to it. We are all a part of it. It has shaped us to this point and has given us all of these abilities. And now all of us scrambling are trying to figure out, my God, in this landscape where almost anything seems possible, where we have become God incarnate over the vagaries of nature, what is it that we should do, and who can tell us? Because the old ways seem like they are not. I don't know how much longer they are for this world. Somebody the other day was pointing out that the Catholic Church is one of the most powerful, long-lived institutions, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know how much longer it will remain so. Like, they're very rich, they're very wealthy, but it seems to me that there's an...
Hopefully Pierre doesn't hear this episode.
I know, sorry, Pierre. But I think that there is a shift towards people looking for some other source of should. And this is kind of what I feel like a lot of your work, a lot of anthroposophy, a lot of Steiner, this rebirth of a Goethean perspective on the world is trying to come back to this thing of like, okay, what are we tuned to in this symphony, and why should we?
So I think you're completely right that we have been kind of shepherded by these religious institutions, for example, and political institutions for a very long time. I think, and this is a major project I'm working on right now, is kind of looking at the history of human consciousness as a kind of individuation process by which we are becoming more individualized, developing greater senses of self-agency and moral agency, intellectual agency, creative agency over time. But part of that process is that at some point the training wheels have to come off, and we have to actually be able to open our eyes and be like, okay, what are we actually trying to do here? And I think that's a threshold we're coming upon right now, and we're having mixed feelings about it, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it is a pivotal point. It's an inflection point. Like, things are changing rapidly. All these technologies are coming online. And I think that the next few years are really going to be illustrative, because I like to be able to think that it's possible to look into the past and then to model the present on the basis of that, where it's like civilizations fall for these and these reasons, and our civilization will fall for those reasons as well. And I'm like, I think that when you cross some kind of technological threshold, that might not be true anymore, where it is so different categorically that there's a limited number of lessons you can learn from the past, and the only thing that we have is our intuitions about the direction that we should go into. And it's clear that there are two very different intuitions, because there's a very passionate contingent of transhumanist accelerationists that are like, no, this is the direction that we go in, this is the right direction. There's a totally different contingent of people that are like, no, back to the land, the behemoth is about to fail, we must be able to avoid it when it does. And they're, farming and living in rural areas. And I think we are watching this grand transition in a way that hasn't happened in a long time. And we kind of have front row seats to it, which is pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe this is a good place to put a pin in it.
Yeah, for sure, man. It's always really fun to hang out with you. Yeah, we should just do it again.
I have a good reading list, which I appreciate.
Yeah, totally. I will totally check out that Starborn. What was it?
Star Maker. Yeah.
Star Maker. Got it.
Star Maker. Check it out.
All right.
It's also an easy read. You don't even have to read the whole thing. You can just read part of it. You just get the point. It's amazing. But yeah, good to see you, Kehlan.
Yep, good to see you guys as well. We should totally do this again sometime. Always super fun to chat with you guys. I love how we can just bounce ideas endlessly. So anyway, yeah, have a great day, and I'll see you guys around for sure.
All right, thanks, man.
Sounds good.
See ya.
Bye, Kehlan.
Bye, everybody.